Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Maggie Ibrahim-Taney, and I'm the Alumni Director for the College of Arts and Sciences and UC Libraries. Before we get started with our program, I just want to say a huge thank you to our event co-chairs, Diane Dunkelman and Buck Niehoff. Today would not be possible without their support. So thank you so much for your continued support of UC Libraries, and the UC Press. I know we have all gotten used to using Zoom over the last 18 months, but it is always good to share a few housekeeping items. We will be keeping everyone on mute to avoid any potential feedback and to make sure that you can hear our speakers. This session will be recorded and shared in a follow-up email and posted on our YouTube page. Following the interview, we will have about 15 minutes for our speakers to answer any questions. If a question occurs to you during the interview, I invite you to share it in the chat as I will be moderating and will make sure it gets asked. And during the Q&A, I also invite you to turn on your video, as in this virtual world, it is always great to see your smiling faces. Let's get started. I'm thrilled to begin our program this afternoon by introducing Liz Scarpelli, the University Press and Publishing Services Director for the University of Cincinnati Press. Liz is a veteran in the publishing industry with over 30 years of textbook and scholarly book experience. She moved from the lower Hudson Valley of New York to Cincinnati in 2017 with two of her three sons, her dog, and parents to launch the UC Press and Cincinnati Library and Publishing Services, where the focus is innovative, interactive books and social justice, academic community partnerships, and regional interests. As the director of the press, Liz has created a thriving publishing imprint for the university, producing 15 books, trade and scholarly books, 6 journals, including Music Research Forum, Focus on German Studies, Visible Languages, and Teaching and Research Learning, and numerous student and faculty proceedings. Under her leadership, the press has also become an important employer for students at the university, providing jobs for 6 undergraduate and graduate student interns each year. She received the university's Staff Excellence Award in December of 2020, appears regularly on publishing industry panels, and most recently recorded a podcast on the innovative publishing of the UC Press. She will receive a master's in higher education administration from UC did in April. Welcome, Liz. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Maggie. I appreciate you helping to get this program together for us. First, what I'd like to do is introduce our wonderful guest today, Kathryn Clarke Albright. Kathryn is the author of Exploring the Architecture of Place in America's Farmers Markets, and one of the first 10 books that we published at the new UC Press. It was also the first open access book that we published, so that was very exciting for us as well. I am dealing with one screen today, so it's going to take me just a minute to flip between looking at everyone and actually going over to my notes, so please excuse that. But let me explain a little about what we're here today for. It's my pleasure to introduce Kathryn Clarke Albright. Kathryn Clarke Albright is a professor in the School of Architecture and Design at Virginia Tech, where she teaches undergraduate students at multiple levels of the architecture program. Kathryn has served as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the College of Architecture and Urban Studies since 2016. Prior to coming to Virginia Tech, she practiced from 1986 until 1993 in San Francisco as a partner with Solomon Inc., focusing on urban design and various scales of residential projects. In 1994, she earned a Master's of Design Studies from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Albright's research focuses are on the multiple scales of the urban condition that include work with the Blacksburg Farmers Market, which is just on the edge of Virginia Tech. In 2001, she founded Friends of the Farmers Market, a 501c3 nonprofit in Blacksburg, and led the efforts that resulted in the 2009 opening of Market Square Park with its timber frame pavilion. In 2020, we, as I just said, published the University of Cincinnati Press, published the Exploring the Architecture of Place in America's Farmers Markets. Albright's current focus is on the role of Blacksburg Farmers Market played as community gathering places during the pandemic. Kathryn, welcome virtually, unfortunately, but welcome nonetheless to Cincinnati this evening. Here it's rainy, cold. It's just really feels like the beginning of winter. How's things going out there in Virginia?
Well, thank you, Liz, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's really nice to actually meet you sort of face to face. We've only talked on the phone since we started working together. I'd like to acknowledge Peter Potter, who's here. He's the person that introduced me to Liz and encouraged the book along all its way. I think he gained the notoriety as my developmental editor when he would point out places where the book was a little slow or something, and always encouraged me to think about what I was really trying to say. So Peter, thank you so much. I'm glad to see you tonight.
Absolutely. And I was going to share a little bit about how actually you came to the press, because that's always interesting to me, is how presses find their authors and vice versa. So as Kathryn said, Peter Potter, who is also joining us this evening, is the publisher of Virginia Tech University Press. And I've known Peter for probably about 15 years or so. And about 5 years ago, well, probably about 4 years ago, Peter and I became part of the same publishing grant for monographs, which was a study to identify how monographs that were published in open access, meaning that they would be freely available to people, could actually work. What would they do to the sales of the book? And so Peter called me and said, you know, I have this architecture faculty member, dean, who is writing a book on farmers markets, and there's actually a case study in there on Findlay Market. And do you think you'd be interested in taking a look at it? And being that we have a regional list, and I'm very interested in doing everything from history to light and lively, art and culture, I very much wanted to take a look at it. And so that's more or less how we started. Our press primarily publishes, like I said, regional studies and also social justice and academic community partnership books in print, in ebook, in open access format. But I really wasn't that familiar with farmers markets outside of visiting some myself. I've been down to Findlay Market a number of times, probably at least once a month for the last 4 years that I've been living here. And I frequent my own Blue Ash Farmers Market at Summit Park on Wednesdays in the summer, the Montgomery Market on Saturday mornings, which is open from May till October. So I definitely have been to my share of farmers markets, but I really didn't know much else about them. What I really fell in love with about Kathryn's book was the fact that it was more than an architecture book. It covered philosophy. You know, her first chapter that goes into the food with a face is really philosophical. She talks about economics in talking about farmers markets being business incubators. She gives you history of how farmers markets and public markets came into being in this country, and sociology of how people move, how people interact, interface. So it really was so much more than an architecture book, and that's what I really enjoyed about it. So in any event, we were able to figure out a way forward with the book. Peter was instrumental, and it was great to work with him in that capacity. And so now here we are today, 2 years after the book has been published. It has been seen and downloaded in page views over 1,800 times. We have sold numerous copies of the book as well in print and in ebook, but it's an exciting new adventure for us. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump into some of the questions that I have. One of the things I want to just mention, and what Kathryn mentions in the book, is that we do use the term farmers market and public market somewhat interchangeably. And so I may say one or the other during the conversation. But let's get started back, pre Virginia Tech days. You talk about your interest in the community gathering spaces, starting with the time you lived in the Bay Area in San Francisco, when you worked on urban design spaces. When did you get interested first in farmers markets? How did that happen initially?
Well, it actually happened after I came to Blacksburg, and I was continuing my study of community gathering places and looking around in Blacksburg, where did the community gather and what made it a place and what sustained its role in people's lives. And so that's, I started to just study the Blacksburg market, and because I wanted to say what fostered engagement among people of all ages, mixed ethnicities, and varied economic status. And that's really what started to intrigue me about the farmers market. But then as an architect, I kept trying to figure out what was making this have a distinct character, or making people want to linger after purchase or things like that. And so that's when I really started looking into farmers markets, and I got involved with some of the vendors about a possible vision for a market structure, and really started studying with students in different seminars, what were the components that were important to the different people. So the vendors clearly have displays that are of concern to them. But then there's the town who owned the property where the market was located, and their interest, in servicing the community with a community gathering place. So that's really kind of how I started into it. And then that was like 1998 when I really dove in deep, and then started the nonprofit you mentioned in 2001. And that was really key because the town saw the commitment there, and then they asked the Friends to take over operations of the market, and it just the relationship got stronger and stronger. And so really the initial stages was quite local and quite sort of limited. But it wasn't until I started thinking about it in the bigger picture across the country, because at the time they started to really expand and grow, and the USDA started to keep records of the number of markets, that then I started to look at the bigger picture of typologies of markets or location and the different scales I talk about in the book.
I love that. And you've just touched on probably 3 other areas that I want to dig into. But I'm going to go back to something you said toward the beginning of your response. And it's actually part of the title of the book. You talk about the architecture of place. And certainly there's different types of architects, but architecture of place is fascinating to me. And I wonder if you might talk for a little bit on what exactly that means. Is that a concept? Is that something practical and tangible? How does it move from that conceptual idea to implementation and execution? So
architecture of place is the origins of it are probably in what Project for Public Spaces, a nonprofit, really started popularizing I would say the late 70s, or placemaking. So how do we make place? And so then I was really trying to tie it to architecture in specific. And it is actually conceptual. It is also practical and tangible. So it's all 3 of what you ask. It's conceptual in that its idea of placemaking is based in collective meaning making. So how do we make meaning in our lives through our experiences? And then it's practical in that it involves this individual and social meaning making through not simply the moment of the experience, but also through the repeat visits. And so it's part of the ritual of, if not daily life, weekly, monthly, seasonal. I mean, there's all sorts of layers there. And then the architecture of place is tangible because it engages the human body and its senses. So it dazzles the eyes, it teases the nose, it invites touch, it satisfies the mouth, and then it excites the ears with all its hustle and bustle. So that's kind of just a very short answer to that pretty large question.
And I love that idea. I love how you incorporate the senses in there, because you're absolutely right. And I imagine some of them do it better than others. You know, I'm familiar with Reading Terminal Market, having been on the East Coast most of my life. Reading Terminal is in Philadelphia. And I've been to the West Side Market in Cleveland. I've been to, you know, the farmers market, I guess, over in Seattle as well. So I've seen some done differently, but you describe Findlay Market in the book as having spatial intimacy. And I think that's true. I don't know that I could define exactly how, but there's that feeling I get when I'm in there. It is intimate, crowded sometimes, not crowded other times. But can you give us some examples of what you mean by that exactly? And how is that, why is that important, I guess, to the just the overall look and feel of a farmer's market space?
Well, I think spatial intimacy works in several ways. And, you know, you mentioned it in reference to the first chapter of the book, which talks about food with a face. And so when you are talking to someone 2 feet away, or maybe recently 6 feet away, and you're talking to them about this food, there is a spatial connectedness, right? It's not, and then contrast that to your supermarket or your big box retailer, in which there's no intimacy. There's shelves lined with goods. When you fill up a cart and you get to the checkout, and people are dressed in uniforms, and they enter a number into the cash register, and they don't even know the name of the food sometimes. And then, like me, I check out at the talking machine, right? So there's no intimacy at all with that machine. But then the spatial intimacy also works when, you know, like I said, you're engaging your senses, and you reach for that apple and you smell it, or that tomato or something like that. So there's also that engagement that makes a spatial intimacy. But also when, you know, you see someone else, you go and you hug them, right? It's like, I mean, yes, I've hugged people in the grocery store before too. I'm not saying it doesn't happen there, but there's something about that sharing that moment. And so the spatial intimacy works in different ways. I think at Findlay, the thing that is interesting, because in the main central hall, it's such a grand structure with those Fink trusses that it's almost cathedral-like in some ways. But again, the glass cases where things are displayed, and someone, you know, you point to something and someone goes and retrieves it and then hands it over to you, that engagement, that exchange is, you know, it's a physical and tangible transaction that I think is really important. And then when the renovation happened on the exterior of Findlay, you get these kind of smaller spaces, and people weave in and out, right? It's not down the long central hall. So those are 2 very different spatial conditions that Findlay Market offers.
And then do you also include, when you think about that, because I think we call it the Heritage Market District, if I'm not mistaken. So are you including those shops that are on the exterior as well? You know, there's the tea shop and there's Maverick Chocolates.
Right. Yeah. So I do talk about that in one of the distinct characteristics of Findlay versus some other market districts, that there is a very close relationship between the stores that surround the market building, and both in what they sell and then their relationship to, like you mentioned, some of them are business incubators. And that sort of thing. So I do talk about the importance of the cross section of the street and what's going on with the shops on this side and the market stalls on this side. So
Right. And then, of course, there's a couple of restaurants even there as well.
yes,
That, it just somehow all comes together. And I suppose part of that is serendipitous, and some of it might be by design. Perhaps.
Well, I think it had a lot to do with how the city, as I understand it, the city of Cincinnati's leadership worked with the Corporation for Findlay Market's leadership in the overseeing and the renovation of those surrounding buildings. I think the city owned 39 of those buildings at the time that Findlay was finished being renovated. And so that really, they had control over that. That's a significant number of buildings.
Right. And then, you talk at one point in the book about thinking about how people get to the market, whether they get there on foot or they get there on bike or by public transportation.
Mm-hmm.
All of that is incorporated into, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but not only the vibe, but, the recurrence of the visits, the repeat visits and things of that nature, you really get the sense that Findlay is community driven, that the people that frequent it, we definitely have tourists that are there, but it's part of the intimate community of our city, I believe.
Yes, I would agree that it is very community driven. And I think that the most successful markets have that. Yes, you have the tourists. We have tourists in Blacksburg on football weekends, but then they become part of that market experience.
Right.
And some of them come back every fall. They're in, the Duke football game, or, so there is a certain ritual even to the tourists.
I bet there is. And they want to bring their kids then and grandchildren and share that experience they had 5-10 years ago, that now they can have, whether it's that holiday trip that they have, or sometime in the summer and they go get ice cream or popcorn or that juicy apple, as you said. So one of the things I thought was really interesting, and of course, this is always fascinating to me, because I just assume, I guess it's the same for me as a publisher. People don't really understand how a book gets made. So, I was reading part of the book and you talked about how some markets do it better than others, and how Findlay just, the scale is perfect at Findlay by comparison to some other markets. And I think you did mention a market and I have it flagged here, but that sometimes the scale is not quite right. And so it doesn't provide that opportunity for interfacing as well, or interaction. And so is that part of the architect's job as they're kind of working with the leaders? And obviously that's in a permanent structure. That doesn't work so well in these pop-up markets that we talk about.
Yeah. Yes. So, I think the market you're referencing is the Eastern Market in Washington, D.C., which is it's a grand, 18 something, I forget the year of its construction. And at the time, public markets were seen to be as need to serve as landmarks. And so big, tall, or buildings with lofty ceilings would allow for air circulation and light, skylights and different kind of natural lighting. And so that's often why the buildings were built that way they were. And I think the thing that Eastern Market, when it renovated, they didn't open up its perimeter and scale it to the human scale like Findlay did. And so that's, I think, the thing that Eastern Market still is great. I'm not saying it's not good just because of that, but it does have a grander scale, and it's not as spatially intimate as Findlay. And I think that's one of the things you'll find, like in you mentioned Reading Market. I mean, they have hundreds of vendors, you know, and it's just the sheer scale of going down the aisles. Or you mentioned Cleveland's West End Market in the Ohio City neighborhood. Again, that's a very grand space, and there they have stalls that were added around the perimeter. They're more human scale, but it's separate from the Grand Hall building. So yeah, there are, but I think more modern markets that have been constructed are mostly more human scale. They're not as grand. They're not as seen as such grand structures.
So there are basically 4 types of markets you talk about in your book. The heritage markets that we're familiar with from our own city, in Findlay Market, the open air pavilions, and I want to hear some more about your work with Blacksburg Market, and then also, of course, the pop-up markets that we all see in parking lots all over the place in our cities and towns, which are wonderful. And then there's the one that I thought was really intriguing. And again, this is where I think, you know, I learned a little about economics from your book with these SNAP programs and the mobile pop-up market, the mobile markets. But let's talk about the open air pavilions for a minute and some of what's going on in your own markets here in from Virginia.
Yeah, so the open air pavilion market is an interesting type because it often gains its stature in as a civic gathering place because it's also used as other things on non-market days. And so people have different ways of interacting with this place and this meaning making that's not just the farmer's market, but it's the structure. And so I think of in Waynesboro, they have a pavilion in a park along the river, as does in Little Rock, Arkansas. They made it a feature of the park to have this pavilion that has the farmer's market in it.
And I think the one that you had mentioned in the book as well, I remember the one you mentioned in Arkansas, the one that I noted was that Fifth Third Pavilion in Lexington.
Yeah.
I think they have an ice skating rink, and they have on-food days where it's an artist's venue. I find that, I mean, that to me, in and of itself, it sounds lovely to have something that is accessible to the community in so many different ways.
Yes, Manassas also has one that has a skating rink, and it's right near the train depot. So they are special events throughout the year. But you have the open air pavilion at Findlay too for the organic farmers market. True,
very true. We do. Findlay. I could be down there much more frequently than I actually am.
Yeah.
So let's talk for a minute about the idea for the book. Obviously you're passionate about farmers markets, you're passionate about relationship and the experience, but how did that turn into an idea for the book? And what in your mind were some of the goals that you were trying to hit for readers?
Well, as I said, I started my involvement through the Blacksburg Farmers Market, and it was gathering all this information to figure out what we wanted to do there. And then I saw all these different questions that needed to be addressed, and the community, the public, and they were supportive, but they didn't know how to sort through all the issues, and as did the town leadership, didn't really know how to sort through the economic portion of it, or the importance of just, I mean, well, let's see, trying to think about all the different things, the vendors and what they're allowed to sell and this sort of thing. So it just came that there was all this information, and I thought it would be really interesting to try to write a book that wasn't only about the architecture, but about all these other aspects that were, I think, part and parcel to its success. So you can have a beautiful architecture, but unless you have a lot of these other things, it's not going to persist. And you mentioned the SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program that a lot of people call food stamps. I mean, that's another key component that we have accessibility for people of all incomes to come to the market. And so we didn't originally have that at our market, and that emerged. And now, it's a surprise sometimes who comes up and wants to use their EBT, electronic benefits transfer card, because they look like you and me, So So go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to comment that it never occurred to me that in a farmer's market, there would be that opportunity for that level of economic diversity, that it would include that in terms of payment. It just, I think of farmers markets typically more of the pop-up style, where you've got people that, rent a booth, rent a table, rent a whatever. And, there really are, it really is a wonderful opportunity for diversity in the community to come together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think that trying to remember exactly where your question was. I kind of got off. Oh, how did the book come to be?
Right.
So it was that I thought there could be something that could appeal to a lot of different people, everything from the patron to the farmer or the vendor, and then town leadership, which actually kind of made it kind of difficult at one point. And Peter helped me fine tune that a little bit more because you have the different voice you're expressing in the book. It changes from a narrative to some, like you said, historical information, and then it shifts to a story, about this mobile market and how it came to be. But yeah, I just wanted it to be a broad, not an only appeal to architects.
So since we're on the topic, you mentioned the mobile market. Why don't you spend a few minutes just explaining for some of our viewers what the mobile market really is, what that concept is, and what it was kind of born out of.
So the mobile market is a response to what's called food deserts. So places in our cities where there are no stores to buy fresh food. And they have been cut off by the construction of highways and to less or low income neighborhoods. And so in different cities, different groups of people, largely started with nonprofits, would create an urban farm where the kids could learn how to grow their own food, or adults could learn to grow their own food. And then they would take the harvest from those farms and they would pack it onto a converted city transit bus and take out all the seats and put in shelving, and they would drive the bus to the places that needed the food. So they would go to the schools in the low-income neighborhoods, and they would go to the nursing homes, or they would go to places where people did not have easy access to fresh food, and bring the food to the people. And then often these were people who were on these SNAP benefits. So they're in Baltimore, they're in Washington, they're in Chicago. I mean, they're everywhere. And they often will take the bus to every day, it will stop 2 or 3 times at a different place, but the same every week. So people can plan on it to get their nutritious food.
What a terrific concept. Do you see that really catching on in other cities?
Yeah, I haven't tracked it in this past year, but I can only imagine that has continued to expand
I
because,
imagine it's very successful in the areas that it's already.
yeah. I mean, it takes a lot of organization with usually an overseeing entity like a nonprofit, and then some connection to the city or leadership. I know in Chicago there's a consortium of farmers who supply the bus. It's not just one urban farm.
So I know in the book you quoted that in the last 25 years, there has been a 400% increase roughly in the number of farmers markets, somewhere I think around 1,700 to now we're looking at close to 9,000. And I saw a quote from from USA Today and the Farmers Market Coalition that said public and recurring assembly of farmers and their representatives selling directly to consumer food, which they have produced themselves. The explosion of farm to table movement in the US has led to a steady growing number of markets. More than 8,600 were registered in 2021. How did you decide which markets were going to be part of the case studies that you created? How did you go from however many you visited and heard about and worked with to picking the markets out in the book? Was there some methodical way you went about identifying which markets would be good examples for your readers?
Actually, no. It was very in a way happenstance. I'd say the market selected me. So for instance, how did I come to know Findlay Market is Leah Broughton Hager, who now is, I think, the president of the corporation for Findlay Market or something, chairman or something. She was living in the Over the Rhine neighborhood, and I went to visit her, and she took me to the market, and that's how my first visit to Findlay was. The same thing happened in Charlottesville. A former student of mine was in grad school at UVA and invited me up one Saturday to go to the market because she knew about my interest in markets. And then I started searching around and trying to find what was going on. And I ran into ones that really had great stories of transformation, like in Abington and Virginia and Durham, North Carolina. Both of them had tobacco-based agricultural economies that were completely wiped out. And local leadership and nonprofits banded together to, in the case of Durham, I think the city purchased all the properties and they made this Durham Park. I think they call it Central Park. Yeah. And then in the case of Abington, they got some federal grant subsidies to help the farmers transition to farming vegetables and animals rather than tobacco. So they just had great stories, and they were both open air pavilion markets located in their downtown. So, it just sort of, like I said, they kind of picked me. And then I lived my husband and I had a townhouse on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. So for 4 years, I shopped a couple days a week at the Eastern Market and sort of lived that life. So that one came in that way. And then I read something about the Staunton Market. I think the market manager at the time was writing something about how to manage markets. So I went to meet him one day, and then I saw what they had. And that was in a renovated wharf district that had been made into a historic district. So they found me.
They really did find you. That's wonderful. I love those kinds of stories. I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure that if our viewers have any questions, they can either share them through chat or unmute. So I'm going to hand it off to Maggie to see where we are in our program.
Thank you guys so much. This is very fascinating. I feel like I myself have at least one question that I want to ask Kathryn, but let's see. So in the chat, we have Peter said he loves Reading Market. Diane had a few comments and a question as well. And she agreed, Kathryn, what you're saying about the opportunities that Findlay has, the continuous diversity of economic access, ethnicity, religious related foods, etc. She did ask, how different is the zygus of a market and a food hall like Harrods? Which Peter did say he tends to see that farmers markets are more welcoming and informal than a place like a department store food hall. So I'm curious what you might have, because I was actually thinking too, Diane, about some of the London markets that are a little bit more farmers, but then you have things like Harrods and even some of the other department stores. So curious what you think about that.
Well, I'm glad I've actually been to Harrods, so I can answer that question with some knowledge of experiencing the space and the food they have to offer. I think again, for me, it would come down to the food with the face, that the person that you're buying it from at the farmer's market has been engaged in growing it or harvesting it or tending to the animals. And versus the person in Harrods probably knows about it because they've been informed about the background of the food, but they're not really invested in having made it necessarily. Now that's probably not altogether true. There's probably people that are baking the bread that you're buying, so they are engaged in it. But I would say the main difference is the whole investment the farmer or the vendor has made in the production of the food, and that transaction being extremely personal. But I'm sure, the people that shop regularly at Harrods and, like I said, buy that loaf of bread and get to know that person and hear stories and, ask them about another recipe. So I'm sure there are exceptions there, but I'm just talking in general. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I was comparing, interested, because you were saying about the contact with the person and talking to somebody about it. And it's funny, you had mentioned, you were just talking about that, and I was thinking, well, the folks at Findlay Market usually aren't butchering their, I mean, there may be some exceptions, but are they butchering their own meats? And so I was thinking about buying meat at Harrods, and I was just wondering, you do have a contact and you can talk to somebody. And it's more interesting because, as you said, that you can have the opportunity to ask recipes and how do you cook this and how do you use this food and what is this, which I think is really interesting. But to me, what's fascinating about Findlay Market and other markets like that in Virginia, where they're just open air, we've been to just some open air markets down around the Greenbrier, and they're selling everything from sheepskins to jams and jellies. But it's so wonderful at Findlay Market, where you see the diversity of people. You see the local over the Rhine people who are just there. Some of whom are in need, and some of whom are just staple features there.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say one thing about the butchering of the meat. I would say that a lot of vendors that sell the meat, they raise the animal, but they don't do the butchering. They take them to a slaughterhouse, but they know that person and they get it cut in certain cuts that they want. And so they're not all the same cuts available at every meat vendor. And so I think that because, and just real quick about the pandemic, so many people started buying food at farmers markets. The slaughterhouses were overwhelmed, and like the sausage making companies ran out of casings. And so, you had to take your sausage loose. There was no, casings to put it in. So that's sort of an interesting thing that even the farmers who were taking their animals to these places to be processed were having difficulty getting their food processed.
Thank you. Do you consider the organization Beekman 1802 a farmer's market? I know they have their own goats and they're producing a lot of their products from goats. Do you know that in upstate New York, I think?
I'm not aware. No, I'm not. Peter, do you know?
No, I don't. It sounds interesting though.
Yeah. Other questions?
Okay, we've had a question come through the chat. The idea of farmers markets as a way to solve the problems of food deserts is fascinating. Is this something you think could become a long-term and more widespread solution to lack of food availability?
Yes, I mean, that's why I said I haven't kept up in the past year, but I bet if I went and started looking at them, they're even more mobile markets than before. I think one thing that I didn't mention, but is another good outcome, or say good outcome for farmers markets due to the pandemic, is that the federal government increased funding for the SNAP programs and distributed the funding to municipalities and their farmers markets and food banks and schools to obtain local and regional food. And so that's an interesting thing that happened, that more, it's not a food desert per se, but more schools and then people at food banks got more farmers market food available than before the pandemic. I know we got like $10,000 in funding from our town to distribute to the food banks and Micah's Backpack and the schools.
Kathryn?
Yes.
Can you hear me? This is Shimo Wang, Dean of the UC Library. Welcome to talk. It's such a wonderful talk. I have a question about the culture of the market in terms of between the countries. I wonder if you have the comments about the market culture in the country, like some of the European countries, seems much more rich than America here. I wonder, was this because of the dietary eating habit change since some time in America, or is more about the commercial supermarket invention to take over the market? And also, where you see when the people starting cooking more, eating more healthy, is the market in America gonna be come back more in the future? So that's just want to hear some comments from you.
Well, I think I've not heavily studied the European markets, and I've not studied other countries, but I have visited a lot of the European markets and looked into it. And I think it was just much more ingrained in the daily life of people in the cities, and there were more of them. And so the supermarket takeover in the United States really was expanded by the use of the car. And in Europe, I don't think the car expanded as quickly as it did in the United States. And then we had a different notion of freshness, I think, because all of a sudden preservatives gave you fresh food. And I don't think Europe had the adoption of preservatives so much in their food. And so freshness meant buying something that had been very recently harvested, because our food travels 1,500 miles sometimes from the farm to the grocery store. Not so much now. it's changed a lot with the supply chain problems. But, and then what was your second question?
I was asking your thoughts. Would you see the people are starting cooking more, eating more healthy, and this will contribute more of the local market going to become back in competing with the supermarket even?
Yes, I think definitely we're seeing this. There was one of the most incredible stories is that when the pandemic hit in March 2020 here in Virginia, we only closed our market one Saturday and it was open all the other times. And at first sales went down to 30% of the previous year, but then they rebounded such that we did not lose any, we did not have a loss of revenues at the farmers market during the pandemic. In fact, there was sometimes vendors said they had 30% more new customers. So I think that experience for people to find the food and then cook the food will change things in the future.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Jason Sharp, and I actually had a question. One thing you mentioned is like how these communities are so, particularly the intimacy of them. And something that's very popular I've seen in grocery stores is pairing with healthcare options. And it seems to me that farmers markets would be particularly well positioned to do community health initiatives and reach out to help people. Are there any precedents where farmers markets are starting to try to have like a community clinic or any sort of physical health outreach?
Yes, I think I'm trying to remember. I think it's in Chicago, maybe some of the other mobile markets where they stop in the parking lot of the hospitals, and the doctors give the patients and the workers prescriptions for which are vouchers to spend at the farmers market. So they're trying to transform a prescription into a healthy way of eating rather than going to the pharmacy and getting some pills.
It seems like they have a unique position where they're a part of the community for a lot of people who need healthcare as well, not just healthy food, but the actual healthcare.
Yeah.
So that's awesome.
Yeah. That would be definitely something to research further and see how it's progressing.
In your travels, Kathryn, do you have a favorite farmer's market?
Well, you know, one of the best things is every market's so unique. It can be your favorite that day you visit it. Because I know Peter lived in Syracuse for some time and would say that was a favorite market. Wouldn't you, Peter?
I was in Ithaca.
Ithaca, excuse me, Ithaca, yeah.
Ithaca has a really great market. That's one of the best that I've ever been to. But yeah, I would agree with you, Kathryn, that it's, you know, everyone has its own. I mean, we were just recently up in Staunton and went to that farmer's market, which you mentioned, and it was fabulous. It was different, but I think everything has its own, everyone has its own character and its own pluses.
I think what's really interesting to me is how committed the people are that sell at the market. You know, it's their livelihood. They're so proud of what they make. They're so proud that you want to buy it. And I think that's just a really interesting phenomena in the age of the internet and how social media dictates how we talk and share, that we can still have the value of the face-to-face interaction and the knowledge that the farmers have and about what they do. I mean, I learned how to maintain my fig bushes from the person selling figs at the farmer's market, not on the internet.
I think that's great. I think that's great. And very true.
Sorry, Liz. I think we have time for maybe one more question if someone has a question.
Maybe one more question, Kathryn.
Yes.
What's your next writing project? what's the next book target?
I don't know that I have decided on the next book. I'm actually very interested to dig into the outcome of the influence of the pandemic and people's return, cooking at home and home gardening. And I'm interested to see that how that's tying into these farmers markets, because they had evidently plateaued in the 2019 around 8,700, and then some, like there was too much, it was not being absorbed fast enough. And I would think now that we might see a resurgence again of some for these different reasons. So I would be interested to sort of see the influence of this of the pandemic on this local food production and also the supply chain, sort of see the collision of those two things.
I think that's exactly one of the questions I didn't ask had to do with the impact of COVID. And, it is kind of that perfect storm of people due to quarantine, becoming more focused on local and what they can do themselves, and just having more time to jump into that. And now with the supply chain issues, I think it will be interesting to see how this spurs on new opportunities for farmers markets.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to point out one of the wonderful things about your book is that you actually give a number of ideas and thoughts in your conclusion. You talk about every farmer's market is unique in its own way. And this is what I tell people when they ask me about what the key to starting a new market in their own community is. In fact, there is no single key, because every community has its own distinct character for this reason. I am convinced that farmers markets are most successful when they organically grow out of the efforts and initiative of the citizens of the community. And I think you've really articulated that in so many ways during the past hour. It's just been wonderful.
Well, thank you. This has been quite enjoyable to meet you all, and I look forward to someday being in Cincinnati again.
We would love to host you again. We would love to have you come and absolutely do some kind of a walk around. I want to thank again Diane Dunkelman, Buck Niehoff, and also Dean Shimo Wang, who the press does report into Dean Wang in the library. And it's been a wonderful opportunity for the last 4 years to be able to bring these kind of books to our local readers and our readers around the world. And it's exciting to know that 1,600 people have read pages of your book. That really is the next generation of reading. And on such an intimate conversation too. Farmers markets, it's just wonderful to know that.
Well, and I would
go ahead.
I would just add that the open access book has been fabulous to share with my students. They want to know about making community gathering places, and they want to talk about this architecture of place concept. And the fact that I can just send them the link and they can read a chapter and then we can have a conversation has been really fantastic. So I thank Peter and you for being part of the grant that enabled that to happen. And so that part has been a great surprise.
I agree. And thanks to Peter and Virginia Tech for making that happen for us. That was a wonderful opportunity for us to bring this publication to life.
It was a great partnership. I think I'm really happy that it worked out. I think that I'm looking for more and more ways to collaborate with other institutions, other publishers, and this is a great way to do it. I mean, you brought certain strengths and we brought certain strengths, and we pulled it off.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you everyone so much for signing in and being able to join. Thank you again to Kathryn and to Liz. And we will hopefully see you all soon. Fingers crossed in person. Take care. Have a good night,
Thank you.
everyone.